There we go. Okay. Welcome everybody. Glad to have you here today for this very informative workshop on grazing and ranch management. Um, I'm Patty Aaron, and I'm a community engagement specialist for the Sonoma Resource Conservation District. And we provide natural resources technical assistance to people in Sonoma County. And hopefully people from outside of Sonoma County who are joining us today as well. I would like to introduce Roxanne Foss, who's going to be our leader today for this workshop. She's a senior ecologist with Volmar Natural Lands Consulting and is a certified rangeland manager. She has a robust understanding of science-based adaptive land management, field survey protocols, and ecological principles. She collaborates with private and public stakeholders to develop useful, ecologically sound, and feasible land management plans in the Greater Bay Area and the Central Valley. She brings a background in academia and active land management to inform rangeland monitoring, rare plant surveys, plant community mapping, floristic inventories, sensitive wildlife surveys, wetland delineations, and baseline inventories on sites throughout California. Welcome, Roxanne. Take it away. Thanks.
Thank you, Patty. And it really makes you realize what a mouthful it is when you hear someone saying it for you. So thanks for going through all of that. And thank all of you for taking time out of your Saturdays to learn about grazing management. I'm excited to be here and excited to learn from our other speakers as well that we'll be hearing about from. And with that, I do want to share my screen so we can see, what's in store for today. And so you can see here is our agenda that we'll be working through. And it's broken into 4 parts where we'll have breaks between each of those sections. First, I'll be speaking about grazing as a management tool and then how to develop a management plan and kind of key components therein. After a 15-minute break where, get to stretch or eat, turn your sourdough starter, etc., we'll hear from some expert panels. We've got 3 grazing operations that'll be joining us. So we have Byron Palmer, Chase and Emma Shamfichi, and Sarah Kaiser will be speaking about their experience, their operations, their approaches. And then lastly, we'll be hearing about support and funding opportunities from Sarah, who will be joining us with a different hat on, as well as Davey with Cooperative Extension. And I'll be introducing each of those kind of as we get into each of the panels. And you'll notice that there's, these 5-minute breaks between each. Those are kind of our buffer period. I'm happy to, keep talking through some of that while people duck in or out. And feel free to kind of communicate with the other friends and colleagues that you see here. I do hope this is a conversation and not just a presentation approach. And we do have this all, it is going to be recorded and available after, so do keep that in mind. And we're happy to answer questions offline as well. Please feel free to use the chat if that's useful for you to kind of hold on to that thought while you listen to the rest of a talk or the rest of our panelists. And then we'll also have time to open it up if you'd like to speak your message, and we'd love to see your face if you feel open to putting your video on. And otherwise, feel free to reach out to any of us after the presentation if there's a question that you'd like to see answered that wasn't necessarily addressed. With that, was there any questions that people had off the bat? And Patty's going to be kind of fielding the muting and the unmuting and all of that, so I'll count on her for that. All right. So without further ado, I'll begin talking a bit about grazing as a management tool. And first, I want to say, what I'm hoping to provide you with this presentation is that we want to give you a better understanding of the benefits and drawbacks to grazing. Think about the differences between the livestock types. We'll be hearing about different livestock types, in further detail from our operators later this afternoon. And then we'll also hear about how to effectively select a livestock type. So, what animals do you want for your property based on your goals? And this will tie in pretty closely to the following presentation, which is about planning and livestock planning, grazing management planning. So we'll see some kind of dovetailing as we go through. To take a step back and just ask, what is grazing? It happens at many scales. We're primarily talking about livestock grazing in this presentation, but in general, grazing animals defoliate plants, removing biomass, redistributing nutrients, trampling the soil and plants. So having livestock or grazing animals or grasshoppers on your property is going to change the way the vegetation and the soil and the communities therein are. Grazing management related is the use of livestock specifically to manipulate the vegetation, the livestock performance, and the ecosystem processes. And so this will tie in really when we think about grazing planning, we think about, livestock management and what are our goals for that property. And again, this will be a little bit more, drawn out in the second presentation. You'll notice that throughout this presentation, there's going to be a number of links that are provided at the bottom of specific slides. And those links are for you to look at. At the end, Patty is going to be able to send out not only this recording, but also the PDF version of these slides so that you can use that to kind of click through if you want more information on, kind of the information that was shared on that slide. Some of these are guidebooks, some of these are kind of general references or, research topics that might be of interest. Specifically, targeted grazing is the application of a specific kind of livestock at a determined season, duration, and intensity to accomplish the defined vegetation or landscape goals. The targeted grazing refocuses, and I think this is an important aspect here when we think about targeted grazing, it refocuses the output of grazing from livestock production to the vegetation and landscape enhancement. So again, goals are kind of going to be woven throughout our conversations about grazing management, but this is where we start to see a transition, not just for livestock production, but towards, are your goals for that land in terms of vegetation and landscape management. So fire fuel reduction, plant community, wildlife, things of that nature. And we'll think about kind of the economic component as well. So I'll discuss a bit about that in terms of leases and licenses and cost balances. And I know that Byron is also going to be touching a bit on those kind of economics in his piece. So why graze? What brought you here today? Why are we interested in grazing? First we think about, well, operationally, why are there animals on the land? From the production of food and fiber. We talked about some of the fiber that Sarah's got, hanging out there. And, the production of food is also a component of that. Many of these animals, the vast majority of them are part of a food production process. And there's also a financial incentive. So depending on what the operation looks like and what those incentives are, that might be a fee for service in terms of targeted grazing. You might be looking at a, more productive, larger landscape where you have cattle grazing and they're paying for the use of that forage, on a year-to-year basis. Or you might have something in between where you have a lot of goals and a lot of restrictions and someone's coming out and grazing it and making it work and they maintain the infrastructure. So there's something in between. But in the end, it financially has to work out for all these parties that want to have those goals implemented on their properties. And lastly is the lifestyle, culture, and legacy. So, in many cases, there's, a culture and community around historic ranching. There's new ranchers that are kind of joining the fold. There's the legacy that people want to share, not only with their families, but with their communities and, what they want to bring into that community. So all of these, play a role in the operational benefits of having livestock operations. But then there's also the ecological benefits. And I think that brings a lot of us here today also is thinking about, we really need this good disturbance, and we may or may not be able to bring other disturbance like fire or other management approaches like mowing. But in the end, at the landscape scale, we're looking at grazing. Grazing can address many of our needs at scales and in areas where we can't otherwise address those needs. So first here, we're going to be going through each of these in greater detail, but we have the fire hazard reduction, certainly of major concern here in Sonoma, as well as, the region and state as a whole, as well as improving the wildlife habitat, increasing native forbs, managing specific weeds, and maintaining open grasslands, so the scenic views that we all value. And lastly, it's really a cost-efficient land management tool. So we'll look at the comparisons with herbicide, masticating or manual removal, but it's a great tool in the tool belt. So first is fuel reduction. And this image here is from the Hopland Research Station, where you can see the fire stopped at a fence line from an ungrazed to a grazed pasture, which I think is anecdotally a lot of what we think about when we think about grazing for fire management. And we can use both targeted and traditional grazing to change those fuels on the land to reduce their hazards. And in so doing, we're changing the type, the distribution, the density of the fuels. So, when I say type of graze, we're looking at the type of vegetation. Is that an herbaceous? Is it a flashy fuel? Is that a woody fuel? So kind of more like a 10-hour fuel, or those big, larger fuels in kind of a forested landscape. Having grazing annually is going to kind of redirect it into more of an herbaceous, kind of flashier fuel, easier to manage, and change the patchiness and distribution of those fuels as well, increasing the bare ground patches. And, as we talked about with grazing, there's also trampling and distributing, the change in that way too. We're looking at grazed landscapes that are typically more accessible and useful for firefighters. So if a firefighter is interested in, creating a location for them to, work out of and operate out of, they're most likely going to choose a grazed site, and that's because there's often well-maintained roads, there's access to water, especially if, you have reservoir or if you have a large amount of water stored on your property, with the 2-inch pipes that they can tap into. And we're also noticing that, these reduced fuels, it's safer for them to be there. They can create lines that they're able to maintain. So creating those grazed landscapes, one firefighter described it as, these are kind of like candy for the firefighters, like get as much candy out as you can. If you get your water, you've got your roads, you've got your grazed landscape, we're going to go hang out there. So, it's an important aspect to think of. Not only are we changing the fuels, but we're making our lands more accessible and easier for firefighters to protect. The benefits to wildlife, specifically here, the grassland dependent species that have some component of habitat or a part of their life that is dependent on a grassland state are definitely benefited by grazing, which brings that good disturbance and maintains the grasslands. So thinking about grassland dependent birds, you can see, the point blue has a lot of information on this as well. Amphibians and reptiles, specifically there's the red-legged frog and the tiger salamander in the region that benefit from grazing. And we have the butterflies and host forbs as well, that cattle particularly are able to select for grasses and allowing some of those forbs to flourish, or targeted grazing in the dry season or kind of early wet season is also able to reduce competition. So those native forbs are able to flourish. Specifically, grazing promotes a lower vegetation height. You can see in this grazed and ungrazed example some of the differences of having grazing on the landscape. It does also reduce the thatch, so the accumulation of biomass that builds up over time. And it changes the structural diversity. So you can see, patches of rushes, bare ground patches, grassy areas, those, pre-existing or expanding brush areas. But it's going to be a much more diverse landscape instead of, a higher, denser, and transitioning to scrub landscape. We're also thinking, in terms of livestock ponds. So this is a really important thing for many of our reptiles and amphibians. Not only are these ponds, artificially created, for livestock historically or more recently, they've created kind of a safe haven for these animals that have been pushed out of their historic ranges that have now, been developed into, either, homes or agriculture, other things. So now, while not originally planned for these animals, it's really important. And the management of those ponds and wetland features benefits not only the livestock, but also the wildlife. Similarly, the summer water available in the troughs also provides water during droughts, extended droughts, and can support wildlife in that way too. I mentioned this a bit when we were thinking about pollinators, but overall increase in native forbs, particularly with cattle or again with dry season targeted grazing. This is the the change in the plant community to have reduced thatch, so the native forbs are better able to come through. There's more light, they're competitively able to outcompete some of those annual grasses that are across the board pretty much non-native. And then an increase in biodiversity. So not only will we have that typical component of non-native annual grasses and forbs, but also the native forbs. And in many cases, if you look at the studies, there's also a bit more of the non-native forbs as well. There's going to be increased patchiness. We talked about this before. And then also, some of the interesting research that Jamie Marty has put together talks about how having grazing will increase the hydroperiod, so the duration of water in seasonal wetlands, particularly in vernal pools. And so that can create the desirable habitat features for the native forbs associated with those wetlands, as well as the wildlife that they support. So weed management can be supported both with targeted and traditional grazing. And when I say traditional grazing, I'm primarily referring to a cattle operation that's either rotated through on a seasonal or a year-round basis, as well as targeted grazing, which we discussed is very specific to a landscape or a vegetation goal, and you're manipulating all of your components of grazing to identify how you're going to really target that fuel or weed or et cetera, other goal. So in this case, you can see, again, an excluded area that is full of weeds and a grazed area that is, just home to a lot of our more typical non-native annual grasses. This is a typical site, I think, for many of us when we think about, well, what are our goals? And, you certainly, someone had some goals and they placed that fence there to, delineate this area. And in this case, this was a larger area surrounding a riparian zone. But as we know, a lot of those upland areas will get choked out with weeds if we don't graze it a little bit or disturb it in some other way. So when we want to manage those weeds, we want to think about what type of weed is it? Is it palatable? Is it toxic? Is it, at the stage where it grows silica bodies, kind of like the bones of grass, like some of our newer Medusa head and barbed goat grass. These are more unpalatable as time goes on and create a dense thatch. We're also, thinking about, well, which animal wants to eat this? If it's grass, we're thinking about cattle. If it's a forb, we might be thinking about sheep. If it's something toxic or woody, we might be thinking about goats. We'll go into that a little bit later in the discussion. But in terms of weed management, the big takeaway I want to say is that grazing is for maintenance and it is not for, eradication. We're not looking at grazing as you hit it one time and you're done. That weed's never coming back. This is an ongoing process. This is an ongoing management tool. It's a great tool in the tool belt. It is one of many tools. And there's some really interesting research that shows the interaction of these different tools like herbicide as well as manual or mowing in combination with grazing is the most effective. So again, one of the tools in the tool belt for ongoing management. Maintaining grasslands is another beneficial use of grazing. And here you can see kind of a historic dairy and, these open vistas of kind of the coastal Sonoma open areas, reflect a disturbance that's been cultivated both from a prehistoric time period with cultural fire and management of resources by, the Native American tribes in the area into a Euro-American kind of dairy and ranching history that was maintained first with some, grazing and fire, and now primarily with grazing. And we are seeing a reintroduction of prescribed fire and cultural fire in recent years. And part of that maintains open vistas. There have been some interesting interviews with folks that, well, why do we manage these lands? Why are we interested in these lands? And, to take a step back from the land managers and owners, the broader, California community as a whole really love seeing these open landscapes on their drives, and it's so interesting to think not only do we have these open landscapes for the plant communities and the wildlife, but also for historic value, prehistoric conditions, and maintaining those open views and enjoyable landscapes. The cost-efficient land management aspect is important when we're thinking about balancing some of these beneficial uses with other tools that we could be using to maintain those or create those benefits. And looking at this graph, it gives you kind of an idea of, how expensive is it, on a per area basis, if you're mechanically going through and masticating, or are you going in and chemically treating, spot treating with a boom sprayer? Are you implementing prescribed fire or using targeted grazing? And while traditional grazing is on there, that might fall a little bit on lower management and cost without having kind of as much of the day-to-day needs as some of the targeted grazing does. When we're thinking about using mowing or masticating, it's highly cost intensive, and it requires a short period of time, but coming back and really getting back at whatever that species that you're trying to reduce, whether that's coyote brush or others. Thinking about herbicide, there's a number of external impacts that might be happening to unintended species or communities, and so using spot spraying and certainly within any regulations that apply is important to consider as well. And prescribed burning, while bringing a very important element of disturbance to the landscape and can mimic or do similar impacts as grazing, it does bring with it air quality concerns. There's a specialized crew that's required that's often not available if they're out fighting fire somewhere else in the state, and there can be permitting difficulties. So this is definitely an opportunity to partner with prescribed burn associations, talking to your RCD and other groups about implementing good fire on the ground, but it comes with its own headaches and may or may not be available when you want it and where you want it. And bringing back the tool, emphasizing that combining those tools is a really useful approach with grazing. And, if you're looking at doing a brush encroachment management, then you might be looking at masticating or burning followed by grazing as a follow-up treatment for years that follow, and looking at grazing followed by spot treatment. So if you graze a landscape, particularly say with cattle out there, and you've reduced a lot of the grass, then all of a sudden your distaff is visible and you can spot treat it. So it makes it easier for you as a land manager to get out there and really hone in on where that targeted weed is. And then lastly, another example here is grazing lightly before burning to improve impacts to medusa head or other late season grasses that might be, a little bit wetter of a burn. So if you graze it a little bit, then you're going to see a better consumption on that targeted weed. And there's some interesting information provided below as well. So feel free to click through that for other examples. So we've talked about the benefits and, the reasons that brought us to grazing. There's also a number of drawbacks to grazing, and it's important to discuss these. I think many of these aspects are important to consider on most of the lands that you all are managing, and there are ways to ameliorate them. And so in the following slides, I'll be providing not only the potential impacts, but also some of the ways to reduce the negative aspects. We're going to be talking through soil impacts, water quality and riparian corridor impacts, fence impacts to wildlife movement, weed introduction and spread, incidental trammeling or loss of sensitive plants and wildlife, as well as potential conflicts with the recreating public if you have public lands or other easements. For soil impacts, higher stocking rates or wet season use of a wet pasture might increase the high bare ground cover. It might increase the amount of erosion, and then in turn, the sedimentation of waterways or drainages, and increase compaction, particularly in kind of clay soils, steeper soils, areas that are already subject to landslides or slumping might be additionally subject to some of these impacts. How to minimize those impacts. There's first, I would say, addressing the season of use in combination with creating pastures that either fence out a problem or isolate an area that can be managed in one way. And in this case, you can see the change of use would be avoiding the wet season in a certain pasture that has a number of wetlands, and ideally having a dry land or upland pasture with off-stream water that's available to livestock during that season of use. You also may want to fence out an area completely. So if you're looking at a spring development, riparian areas, we'll talk a little bit about those later, or areas that just really are too wet for livestock. You might be looking at fencing those out because the benefits are not necessarily going to be outweighing the drawbacks there. You also would want to be placing troughs and supplements in uplands. A lot of historic troughs are placed in riparian areas or near springs, just based on simple, this is where the water source is. It's easy to draw from that and put it in your trough. But there's a lot of support available from NRCS to design and move that water away from the original water source and up into your upland areas that might be undergrazed and would benefit from grazing, and then give a little bit of a break to those more sensitive wetland areas. And that also goes for any supplements. So salt licks or nutrient tubs, placing those away from waterways and drainages and other wetlands to get animals moving into these upland areas as an incentive also, and to draw them out of the wet areas. Another use change that you can have for your livestock is to identify smaller animals. So certainly, sheep and goats are smaller, have a smaller shearing hoof print. They weigh less as well. There are smaller breeds of livestock that you could introduce, like Dexter, and those provide kind of a smaller hoof print and potentially lower impacts to your soils. And lastly, you can see I've provided the minimum RDM standards from the UCANR catalog. And in Sonoma, we're mostly looking at tables 2 and 3. The first table is for drier annual setting, more like the San Joaquin Valley. But in these second two, you can imagine this second table is the annual grassland and hardwood rangeland. So those are kind of more those oak woodlands that are, patchy within a grassland. That's when we're starting to look at the table 2, and it provides a series of numbers based on the slope of your land as well as the woody cover. And you can, in general, when I provide these recommendations, I tend to be more conservative and say, well, what's the steepest area that's accessible to your livestock, and how much woody cover? I always kind of gear my numbers to say, well, let's assume they're mostly going to be visiting your kind of open areas, which in turn have the higher RDM levels. So residual dry matter is that biomass at the end of the year. So in that case, you might be looking at 800 pounds per acre, and that would be relatively low, but still protecting the soil from erosion and compaction and protecting germination for the next year. The last table is the minimum RDM standards for the coastal prairie. So those more productive areas, the wetter on the coast, a lot more perennial grasslands, you'll see a much higher remaining residual dry matter out there based on that perennial biomass. And so protecting those crowns and allowing them to regenerate the next year. Water quality can be impacted by grazing animals. We've talked a bit about this in terms of the soils and kind of wetter areas. And specifically, having the sedimentation directed into these water bodies may or may not cause them to be listed by the Regional Water Quality Control Board, or create problems for your neighbors downstream, or create problems for you on your property. The reduced emergent, so that's the kind of herbaceous, like the rushes and reeds growing in those areas, as well as woody vegetation. So the woody vegetation, like when we're thinking about willows or kind of brush that might be growing along the stream banks, particularly the native plants that we're concerned about. Livestock are more likely to hang out in riparian areas, particularly in the summer and fall, and they're more likely to defoliate and kind of eat and browse when the nutrition in the grasslands is much lower in those seasons. Having animals in waterways can also increase the amount of nutrients and pathogens. In particular, calves are a higher shedding rate of pathogens. That's been noted in the UC Davis Water Lab, UC Rangelands. Ways to avoid those impacts, kind of, touching back on what we've talked about a bit, but reducing stocking rates, so fewer animals will have a lower impact. Adjusting the seasonality, avoiding those hot summer and fall months, either within that pasture, across your property as a whole, or excluding it completely. Looking at providing supplements away from wetlands, constructing any troughs or other developments away from wetlands and riparian areas, and creating those pastures. And this is kind of the sweet spot. I love riparian pastures and wetland pastures because you can more broadly manage those pastures without isolating them and excluding the possibility of grazing. Even if you're resting it for a year or a few years, you still have the opportunity to bring animals in and utilize them to create the other benefits, like reducing weeds or creating heterogeneous pasture, reducing some of the thatch. And in combination with creating either these pastures or excluded areas, you will have to think about creating armored crossings. So that's either for animals to access that water, for your roads to cross a riparian area, provide access between pastures, what have you. But armoring, so when we say armoring, we're looking at adding cobbles and rocks and gravel to make it so that those roads and access points aren't delivering kind of an undue burden of sediment, and instead are able to provide that water and access without creating more problems. The last few points in there, we have avoiding having young calves in drainages. It's again based on their ability to shed a greater load of pathogens. If you're specifically identified by the Regional Water Quality Control Board, that might be an area of concern for you. And then lastly, addressing roads and sedimentation. Roads are a huge source of sedimentation and erosion. So in addition to livestock grazing, it's important to look at your roads also to see where the problem lies. If you can change the way that your roads are, you might be able to reduce a fair amount of the sedimentation that you're observing. Fence impacts are important to think about, not just for the example here shown, which is essentially deer fence, but used to hold in sheep, as well as cattle fencing, which primarily consists of barbed wire strands. Livestock fencing can limit the movement of livestock, limit the movement of wildlife, as well as cause the loss of wildlife. And ways to avoid that will be discussed in the next slide. But in particular, the low barbed wires or mesh fencing was typically used as permanent fencing for smaller animals like sheep or goats, will block the smaller animals from moving below. And then higher fences are going to block large mammal movement. So as anyone knows who has deer fence, to avoid having them in your gardens, the higher fence are going to block animals from jumping over and moving through that area. As well, having close-spaced barbed wires can cause entanglement, and if an animal is trying to jump over or cross over, they can get caught in those upper wires and not be able to leave. So, ways to avoid some of those impacts or reduce those impacts include avoiding fencing where possible. If it makes sense to have a gap, if you have a natural steep drainage that your neighbor also isn't as worried about it, and if they escape there, you can get them back. It might be nice to avoid fencing to allow wildlife to move through that area. If you have unnecessary fences from, historic grazing operations, to remove those so that don't create entanglement on your landscape where they're not even providing you a fence service, to remove those is helpful. Using virtual fencing wherever that's feasible. I know there's a lot of research in the UC Cooperative Extension, particularly on this. It's expanding and of interest. If you have good service, and if you have areas where you're able to implement this based on your relationship with your neighbors, that's certainly worth looking at. And if nothing else, as a potential for cross fencing or internal fencing that delineates your pastures. You can also create wildlife crossing at established game trails. So looking prior to establishing a fence or maintaining it, identifying those areas. Wow, they're really moving up out of the creek here. This seems to be the game trail that I want to place a wildlife crossing. So you'd have a lower top wire, a higher bottom wire, using some smooth wires so that it's a little bit easier for animals to move through without allowing too many livestock to go through, and if anything, just calves perhaps. The other important aspect is to regularly check and maintain your fences to make sure that they're taut, and to use smooth top and bottom wires, no mesh, and a higher bottom, lower top, and a gap. There's additional resources here from Montana. Those have been adapted into many local standards as well. With weed introduction and spread, livestock grazing may increase the introductions of any weeds that hadn't prior been on your property, as well as allowing weeds that previously were there to spread. And that depends on their palatability, your grazing seasonality, the overall grazing regime. And it can happen particularly in areas that are more compacted, so clay areas, if there's more bare ground, higher levels of disturbance around a trough or things of that nature. And you can see in this picture, this is an example of where we rested a pasture, where we were looking at distaff in combination with herbicide. So, when we think about grazing, we're thinking about, okay, not only do we have to manage our livestock to manage weeds on a whole, but we have the opportunity to provide a targeted grazing approach to address the weeds in those specific locations using a targeted approach. So you can reduce new weeds by using a holding field if you're going to move livestock on there that have been from an infested site. So you know, oh, there was a bunch of distaff or medusa head. I don't have any on my property. I'm going to have them on my holding field. So if they poop out any seeds, then I can pull them there and I know that we're good for a few days. You could also walk areas that are highly disturbed and act as vectors. So those are roads, feeding areas, water developments, things that are more likely to have weeds. Also, if you have any PG&E easements, those tend to be weed spots too. So visiting those on an annual basis and pulling out any new populations. Reducing existing weeds, you'd want to, potentially rotate your livestock or rest pastures to minimize the bare areas or compaction. So addressing, what the cause is of that weed. Is it there because there's compaction? Is there a lot of use in that area? Is it localized, or is it across the board in, the whole pasture as a co-dominant? Targeted grazing can address specific, palatable weeds. There are compromises that you're making to your livestock health, and you can work with a targeted grazer. We'll hear more about that later. You also can employ an integrated pest management program. So like we talked about before, incorporating your other tools in your tool belt. Incidental loss might include trampling a rare species. That might be in a stock pond, egg masses of red-legged frog, what have you, that you might lose to incidental occurrences of livestock walking through, as well as oak regeneration. And I know Lynn had mentioned this as a concern too. So thinking about, well, is it an oak area that we want to exclude so that we can manage that as a separate pasture? Or do we want to fence off these individual oaks and protect them, one by one? Reducing the potential loss, to take a step back, you want to identify, well, how sensitive is this species or population? Is it regulated? Are there agencies that I need to talk to? And then moving from there. So once you've consulted with any partners or agencies, you can identify avoidance measures. So whether you want to create that pasture or do surveys to, make sure that what we're doing on the land is not having an impact on them in the long term or short term, as well as providing exclusion fencing. So you can see there one example of oak exclusion fencing. But overall, the takeaway on this incidental loss issue is to look at the overall benefit of livestock and overall providing those benefits of open grasslands, heterogeneous habitat types, and versus the loss of a few individuals. And if the benefits overall to creating the habitat that has produced and supported this species or population, you might still look at having a livestock operation with a few adjustments to maintain those habitat needs. For recreation, we want to think about the different stages of life and different classes of animals that are going to have more issues, and then what type of recreation is occurring. So particular dogs can be of issue, especially off-leash dogs during calving season. And then the other issue that comes up often is mountain biking, where they're leaving the gates open. So we're thinking about cows that are more aggressive when they have calves. They're off-leash dogs that are more likely to harass or chase livestock and then have that cow coming back at them, and an adult, the human trying to protect their animal, that can create conflict. Also understanding that stalkers are curious, cattle are curious, people might be uncomfortable with that sometimes. Lastly, hoof punches and poop happens on trails. We can avoid that to some degree, as we'll talk about here. So conducting calving either offsite or away from a busy area, selecting docile cows if you have a cow-calf herd, armoring trails and roads that are in wet areas, avoiding areas that are wet in general, so that those trails that run through that area aren't affected, creating bull pastures that are not accessible, so at least when they're not out with the cows, they are in a separate area. And then building gates that are compatible with whatever use that you have, so that they have a spring installed so that they close after use. So picking the right animal for the job, and I realize I'm kind of sliding a little bit into my time here, so I'm going to breeze a bit through these slides and give you kind of the broad takeaways that I think we'll hear more about from our later speakers. But cows in general are going to be in lower areas. They're going to be preferring a kind of like grass type of forage as opposed to sheep, which are looking more at grasses and forbs. They're able to select a little bit more with their smaller muzzles. And then goats that are much more selective, nimble, they're able to get up on hind legs. They're able to eat more toxic plants with an enlarged liver, and they're able to get woody plants as well. So there's these next few slides are a summary of each of those animals. We're going to be talking a bit about the kind of planning aspects and payment structures more. When we're thinking about cattle, we also want to think about what type of cattle do you want on your property. The most typically you're going to see either a cow-calf or a stocker operation. Cow-calf is the resident herd that's either there seasonally or year-round. There'll be fewer animals. You can select them to be docile, and there are going to be a few roundups for treatment throughout the year. Whereas stockers are going to be there on a seasonal basis. These are the weaned calves that are either unbred females or they're castrated males. This is a short-term use that's there just to kind of capture that peak productivity in the spring. They're more curious, more likely to push your boundaries. They're not familiar with the area like a cow herd. And in the area, we're also familiar with a lot of dairy cows. So not only will there be a heifer herd that's much like a stocker herd, but there'll also be dairies, and you'll see a lot more use around the milking barn, visiting there twice a day, and a higher nutrient requirement. So sheep, I mentioned before about the forbs and grasses, based on their body type and their ability to go on steeper and moderate slopes. They're smaller, more nimble, and they're typically part of a paid service. So this would be something you'd see on the $500 to $1,500 per acre. And that's based on the amount of work that's required to bring those animals to the property. Very similar with goats, just seeing again that ability to eat some toxic plants and brush, but certainly work with your targeted grazer about specific problematic species that are toxic to them. And lastly, I do want to mention horses, because while they're not on our typical list of livestock, they are out in our rangelands, and they do provide some services. They prefer grass. They are hindgut fermenters. So instead of having a foregut, four-chambered rumen that's able to take a lot of this roughage and produce the nutrients that they need with their symbiotic bacteria, they do have an enlarged cecum at the end that's not as effective, and they have teeth on the top and bottom, unlike the other grazers, which don't have the teeth on the top, so they can clip the grasses down very low. So all of that physiology leads to kind of changes in the land and the use, and particularly their association with boarding or kind of year-round use allows for areas around the barns and boarding areas to be more heavily grazed and potentially more impacted. But also, if your goal is fire safety, that might be what you're looking for. You can also think about the age of animals. Younger animals are going to be eating more new foods. Older animals are going to be more selective. Breeds can be more tolerant to high heat or cold. There's going to be variability in their temperament and their size. During the year, the cows may or may not be lactating or pregnant, changing their nutrient needs. And individuals can be selected that are more able to move into hilly areas, have different preferences for forage, and again, different demeanors. So here's a bit of a review describing each of those preferences, sizes, costs, and how long you would be typically seeing those animals on your land, from the long term, typically with cattle, to the shorter term with sheep and goats. The typical uses and drawbacks here summarized, where the cattle are typically part of a production. So these are, part of the food, whereas we see, sheep, while part of the food and fiber, and goats as well, are more typically used for the targeted grazing and habitat and fuel management approach. And there's specific drawbacks that are, shared with each of them, and some that are more typically associated with those specific animal types, including, more permanent infrastructure required for cattle versus what comes with sheep and goat operations is the mobile fencing, having to truck in water, herding, and guard dog needs as well. And I did talk a bit about some of the horses and their impacts. And with that, I'll take any questions. If there are any. All right. Well,
I have one if you want a weird question. We had a cooperator put some sheep out on a hedgerow. It's a fenced hedgerow with our planted native plants and an understory of weeds, and the sheep were supposed to eat the weeds, and the sheep were going after the woody plants and like stripping them. And my coworker was out there actually watching it. And they got moved into a new place. They went right after the shrubs and did not go after the understory. So that was weird. This just happened this week, so it's fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
Unpredictable animals.
And I'm also happy to I know Sarah and Chase and Emma are also on board. And if they want to jump on with this, with you guys having your on the ground knowledge of that, particularly with this kind of early season, I'm sure that, the timing of that is important in
Oh,
terms of like what's most nutritious to those animals is going to depend, what they're going to go after. But yeah, Sarah, I see you nodding if you wanted to jump in with
Yeah,
that.
I can jump in just a little bit. Hi, Tanya. We've met on
hi.
other meetings, but
Yeah.
there's so many variables. We talk about sheep being grazers, goats being browsers, but this time of year, especially if you have just a lot of fresh grass that doesn't have a lot of lignin in it and doesn't have a lot of nutrients, they're going to definitely go to the brush because they need to regulate their rumen with with some dry forage. And also what have the sheep been on? What are their nutritional needs? But yeah, if you put them in a nice hedgerow where it's got a lot of new green growth, they're absolutely going to go for your brush. So whoever is managing the sheep kind of needs to identify the right period to be putting them through there. Because as your brush gets woodier through the dry season, you're going to have better luck with them not eating that. But it also depends upon what nutrition's on the ground.
So
So
the grass is too green and watery, and they
yeah,
want,
it's like a lot of water, and you'll see it like the sheep their manure gets gloppy and their rumen's carrying too much water. And so they're going to go to fibrous material to regulate that rumen. And this time of year when the shrubs are pushing out new growth, they're
Mhm,
super high in nutrition and
mhm.
the grass is low in nutrition. And also the micronutrients that are in bark right now, because those plants are sending a lot of sugar up through the shrub, they're going to want to eat that bark for the micronutrients that they need. So making sure the sheep have really high mineral support, like lots of mineral salts and everything going into that, and then timing it based on the nutrition in each of the plants is going to help you. But also, I will tell you that running sheep through a hedgerow right now, getting that impact, if it's quick, those plants are going to love it. They will
Yeah, it
recover
is quick.
beautifully. So if you run it through, even if you see them impacting those shrubs, they can pull a little bark off, they can eat that stuff. If you run them through quick and get them out, your plants are going to have this rush of new growth, and it's actually really beneficial as long as they don't stay in there and start to
Right.
wreak havoc on everything.
Yeah.
So that's
Well,
a little bit
that's
of
a
feedback for you.
perfect example of not
Yeah,
knowing
you need
100%.
like what Roxanne was saying, and Chase and Byron are both going to talk. When you're hiring a contract grazer or when you're thinking about grazing for ecological goals, you really need somebody who understands the animals, the timing, the landscape. It's
Yeah.
very nuanced. It's not just like sheep do this and goats do that. There's a lot of more depth. And Chase, I see you're ready to talk now, so go ahead.
Oh yeah, I just was gonna add to that like with the we found if we mix the goats and the sheep will actually kind of learn from the goats sometimes, and so then they'll go to kind of that more that fibery material as well, and vice versa. The goats will do the opposite. So that could be playing into it as well if they had them with goats too.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the herd, but that was this observation that my coworker came back with, and we were just like, what's going on? I thought sheep were supposed to eat grass.
Yeah, it's way more
Thank you.
complex. And
Of
yeah,
course,
like that's
like
why I'm
everything.
glad we're doing this. And Roxanne, your presentation was great. It's really, and yeah, Chase runs what we call flirts, which are a mix of goat and sheep. And they do learn to gain palates from each other and
Mhm.
eat different foods. And then depending upon what the ewes have eaten while they were pregnant, is those lambs are going to develop a palate for the foods that the
Oh
ewes
my
ate. So you're going
gosh,
to have generational changes in palate and what they can eat and stuff. So it's really nuanced as to what you're going to have to see those animals do.
everything is nuanced. Thank you.
Great question, Tanya. Any more out there? Or is any in the chat too?
No questions in the chat.
All right. Well, I guess I'll let y'all get your break before we jump into developing a grazing management plan at yeah, I'll do 10:05 just in case there are folks that are jumping in and out according to that schedule. So yeah, feel free to take a moment and we'll see you at 10:05.